Words are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in, cause we're ready to set.
What's happening, folks? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So with the attack on satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo and subsequent hostage crises in France dominating cable news for the past few days, a horrific event in Nigeria has barely received a passing mention. On Wednesday of last week, members of the Islamist extremist group Boko Haram attacked the border town of Baga, slaughtering women, children, the elderly, and anyone else who couldn't escape in time. According to Amnesty International, as many as 2,000 people were killed in the massacre, representing the deadliest attack in the group's history. Think about that for 1 second. 125 times more people were killed in Baga than Paris, yet somehow only the loss of innocent Europeans is worthy of reporting. Even more disturbing than the willful ignorance and disproportionate coverage of the two events is that Nigeria's president, Goodluck Jonathan, has refused to say even a single word about the bloodbath that took place in his own country. Yes, Goodluck Jonathan somehow found the time to express his condolences for the victims in France, yet was too busy gearing up for his next political campaign and celebrating his daughter's wedding to even bother acknowledging the mass murder of thousands of his own civilians. So just maybe it's time to rethink the $700 million the U.S. sends to Nigeria in foreign aid every year until this man wakes up to reality. But here's a larger point. When we say things like Black Lives Matter, that notion should apply throughout the world, not merely act as a convenient slogan to express outrage within our own borders. Because lives in New York City and Paris matter just as much as they do in Baga. And until Western society collectively comes to this realization, groups like Boko Haram will only continue their butchery under the cover of apathy. Now let's break the set. It hasn't even been a week since the horrific massacre at the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, and people have wasted no time to proudly proclaim their bloodlust and bigotry, with every channel in the corporate media featuring resident experts on the Islamic faith.
You basically have zones where Sharia courts are set up, where Muslim density is very intense, where the police don't go in, and where it's basically a separate country almost, a country within a country.
You know what it sounds like to me, Steve? It sounds like a caliphate within a particular country.
And in Britain, it's not just no-go zones. There are actual cities like Birmingham that are totally Muslim, where non-Muslims just simply don't go in.
Sharia courts have been allowed to be established. Prayer rugs in just about every hotel. Is this a major mistake made by France, Europe in general? Are we making that mistake in the United States, not insisting on assimilation?
16% of French citizens support ISIS. Would you describe those who support ISIS as Islamic extremists? Do you support ISIS?
I do hold Muslims responsible to this degree. I don't think that we can solve this problem, Don, until moderate Muslims really speak out, really say, this is not our religion, this is not something we can accept.
See, that last point would be really convenient, if only it were true. In reality, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single Muslim organization or community leader that hasn't vehemently condemned the attacks, including some right here on this show. But facts don't satisfy people like Rupert Murdoch, who's hell-bent on insisting that all Muslims are responsible for the actions of a few crazy people who associate themselves with the religion. Not only does this warped mentality scapegoat 1.6 billion people on Earth, but it also washes away the fact that Muslims were victims of the attack as well. And not just victims, heroes. Like Lassana Bathily, an immigrant from Mali who shepherded customers into the freezer to hide while working at the deli under siege. Or Ahmed Merabet, the cop who died confronting the gunmen as they wreaked havoc on Charlie Hebdo's headquarters. There's also little mention of the 33 threats and 21 attacks on Muslim institutions in France in the wake of the massacre, from shooting at Islamic buildings to throwing grenades at mosques. So while pundits like to blame Islam for not understanding the right to free speech, remember that Ahmed worked to defend the magazine's right to mock his religion every day. and in fact died doing just that. But moderates aren't the only Muslims who have condemned the attack. So-called radical Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah publicly declared that extremists hurt Islam more than cartoons. See, insisting on collectively punishing 1/5 of the world's population invokes an arrogant colonial attitude that only seems to be leveled in the wake of Islamic terrorism, when the truth is that no Muslim should have to condemn an attack that has nothing to do with them. If a person's psychotic enough to go and kill people, they'll find reason. And amidst the nonstop media coverage of Islam's inability to laugh at itself, there's been little mention of the fact that countries across Europe already place restrictions on freedom of speech. In France, those limitations have disproportionately targeted Muslims, whether it's banning the niqab headscarf in public or certain pro-Palestinian demonstrations, or denying the Holocaust. Yes, in many EU countries, legislation exists that criminalizes Holocaust denialism and anti-Semitism, a slippery slope that some say could include criticism of Israel, which is why the greatest irony of all is that Charlie Hebdo itself fired a columnist in 2009 for publishing an anti-Semitic cartoon. But hey, they laugh at everyone, right? Look, no matter how reprehensible certain language may be, if you're defending free speech on one end, it better be applied across the board. Of course, acknowledging this unequal reality doesn't serve the mighty clash of civilizations narrative that politicians and establishment media have been peddling since 9/11. The notion that violent tension between Islam and the West is inevitable. Born-again Christian George W. Bush himself said he was on a mission from God when he launched the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, invoking religion many times before enacting murderous policies. Not to mention Eric Prince, former Blackwater CEO of the mercenary force enlisted to carry out America's dirty work, who views himself as a Christian crusader tasked with eliminating Muslims from the earth. Interestingly, I don't remember the outcry about Christian fanaticism causing the deaths of over 1 million Iraqis. Aside from its pure insanity, this type of crusader language only exacerbates the jihadists' belief that they're indeed fighting a holy war with the West, thus justifying their martyrdom. Overall, this attack is not about Islam. It's not about childlike concepts of good and evil. It's about a system that breeds inequality and oppression, the outcomes of which are exploited, the causes complex. It's not a fight between Islam and the West. It's a fight between the most extreme and militarized ideologues on all sides. And too often, innocent people are the collateral damage. No act of terrorism takes place in a vacuum, and the attacks in Paris are no exception. It's with this thought in mind that my next guest penned a column for Truthdig entitled A Message from the Dispossessed, in which he lays out what happened in France in the context of global events. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, former Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, and joins me now to discuss Charlie Hebdo and the roots of radicalization. Chris, amazing to have you on. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start by asking you about the most recent piece you penned concerning the Paris attacks, in which you write the terrorist attack in France that took place at the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo was not about free speech. It was not about radical Islam. It did not illustrate the fictitious class of civilizations. It was a harbinger of the emerging dystopia where the wretched of the earth, deprived of resources to survive, devoid of hope, brutally controlled, belittled and mocked by the privileged who live in the splendor of indolence in the industrial West, lash out in nihilistic fury. Chris, how was this attack about the global dispossessed?
Well, let's take the life of a young Muslim male in a refugee camp, for instance, in Gaza, where he's, of course, trapped. Gaza's a vast open-air prison run by the Israeli government, sleeping 10 to a floor. The water is rancid, so he has to walk blocks through the muddy alleys of the refugee camp to get drinkable water. Hunger and even malnourishment is rampant. He's lining up for food. There's no employment. He has no possibility of marriage. The only thing that holds together his life living on $1 a day, if that, is that call to prayer 5 times a day. The only thing that gives him any kind of dignity or self-worth is his identity as a Muslim. And when we see privileged journalists, or satirists, whatever, in the industrial North, mocking that which is all these people have to hold on to, I think it illustrates the vast misunderstanding and divide that exists between the wealthy elite of the world and over half of the world's population that lives in misery. And I think you touched on it at the top of the show, the whole idea that there's any kind of parity in a country like France, and I lived in France, I lived in Paris. You can go to prison for a year if you are a Holocaust denier and pay a $60,000 fine. If you wear the niqab or the burqa publicly, that is the traditional headscarf, and the niqab is the veil that just has the eye slit. You are arrested. You have to pay a $200 fine and do community service. You're not allowed to wear a hijab, which is just a headscarf, into hospitals, government buildings. The Holocaust is taught in the French school system, and yet the War of Independence on the part of Algeria, the former French colony, where estimates are as high as 1.5 million Algerians died, horrible abuses and atrocities, is not taught at all. And so Muslims are told, and France is an extremely racist country. I mean, I've watched the French police pull North Africans off of the Paris metro and beat them on the platform. Constant identity checks, and they're trapped out in these ghettos, these banlieues, where they're kind of Stalinist housing projects, segregated from the rest, whether that's in Lyon or Marseille or anywhere else. So the message to Muslims is clear. Your history, your traditions, your culture don't matter. And I think the other issue that we want to raise is how those who grow up in these banlieues, in these impoverished housing projects, have had their identity stripped from them. The French do not consider them French, and when they go back to Algeria or Tunis or Morocco, where they may have been born and lived briefly, they're alien outcasts. And so they become prey for these radical groups that prey on their despair, their loss of identity. And that's no different from any kind of binary group, whether it's the Red Brigades or the old fascist or communist party. So it's not anything endemic to Islam or the Quran. It's a response that's bred out of dispossession, poverty, aimlessness, and despair. It has that veneer of radical Islam, but that's not the origin of what's happened.
Chris Hedges will be right back after the break.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight.
Give it to us.
Redacted is full-on awesome.
So
good. The only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America.
You guys do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
Yeah, he doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, he sent us an email.
You know that guy who wishes someone would spy on him? How about the woman who enjoys being lied to by her government? This citizen can't get enough congressional inaction, and this taxpayer wants the mainstream media to be more corporatized. While this person would rather eat genetically modified food, this one thinks our prisons are not crowded enough. And what do these people have in common? They don't exist.
And we're back with journalist and author Chris Hedges. Chris, I wanted to jump right in here to the colonial Algeria, because you mentioned that briefly, and I wanted to dig into how the history of colonial Algeria fits into this Paris attack.
Well, the French have amazing historical amnesia over what they did in Algeria. The estimates are by Algerian historians that 1.5 million Algerians were killed in that conflict. French historians claim only 400,000 on both sides, which I think is extremely doubtful, having covered Algeria. It's just not taught, it's not mentioned, it's as if it didn't exist. And that, of course, exacerbates that whole feeling within the North African community that their narrative, their personal narrative, their cultural narrative is irrelevant. And of course, I think in France it is irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the Karachi brothers were Algerian, just for our audience to understand. I want to play a clip of religious scholar Reza Aslan on Meet the Press this weekend discussing the roots of extremist ideology.
Whether we're talking about Boko Haram or ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, all of these have as their source a single sect, Wahhabism, the state religion of Saudi Arabia. And as most people know, Saudi Arabia has spent approximately $100 billion over the last 20, 30 years spreading this ideology throughout the world.
Chris, do you agree that Wahhabism is the true culprit when it comes to religiously motivated acts committed in the name of Islam?
No. I've been around these groups, and they have a very superficial understanding of their own religion, just like Christian fundamentalists. They know a few slogans, they know a bit of jargon, but it is really about the attempt to sacralize rage and violence, which I don't think is supported in traditional Islam at all. I remember, for instance, in the war in Bosnia, being with a battalion who were supposedly all shaheeds, which means holy warriors, and they were all wearing green bandanas around their foreheads. And they found out that I'd been in the Middle East, and it turns out I was the only one in the entire group who'd read the Quran. So I just don't buy this thing that this is the origins of this come out of any kind of religious belief at all. And I think as long as we follow that track, we are just going to fuel the kind of racism and intolerance that creates this. It comes out of primarily economic and personal despair. And if you go back and read the great writers on totalitarianism, whether Fritz Stern's The Politics of Cultural Despair, Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and others, despair is what propels people into a world of fantasy, this binary Manichaean view where it's the pure versus the impure, good versus evil, that you're anointed to change history, that all non-believers, whatever the ideology, are contaminants that have to be violently eradicated. This is endemic to any radical kind of belief system, religious or non-religious. I mean, the Red Brigades, for instance, had much the same viewpoint. So I think that by looking at particular religious sects, we neglect the real engines of this kind of violence, which are cultural and economic.
Right, it's not Wahhabism that's causing people to strap bombs on themselves. It's the fact that they have no industrial warfare. Let's talk about the Unity March held by world leaders in Paris yesterday, Chris. This was another whole hypocritical kind of front. Right. Yes, despite the fact that the march was supposed to be all about freedom of speech, expression, leaders from countries with gross press freedoms were in attendance. I mean, do you worry that these staged events let world leaders off the hook when it comes to their own countries?
Well, of course, and it's just like 9/11, and when everybody's chanting, je suis Charlie Hebdo, what they're really chanting is, we can't stand dirty Arabs. The idea, it's about celebration of a non-existent virtue within Western society, as if it's an assault on these virtues. And that inability to step into the shoes of a Muslim who lives in France or lives in a refugee camp in Gaza or lives in a slum outside of Algiers, is disturbing. I speak as a former correspondent in the Middle East. That's our job, is to present that viewpoint. And I think that much of what we've seen taking place is a kind of self-exaltation that is very worrying, because that self-exaltation is accompanied by a demonization of others and a misunderstanding of our own culpability, especially within the West. I mean, let's not forget, and I think you also mentioned at the top of the show, the numbers of dead, the terror, the torture, the black sites, the imposition by force of ourselves throughout the Middle East. All of this has contributed far, far more to the radicalization, the fury, justifiable fury and anger throughout the Muslim world than Wahhabism.
Right. I mean, even one of the brothers said that seeing photos of torture in Abu Ghraib helped radicalize him. It's unbelievable. And here's another unpopular point. Anwar al-Awlaki, I mean, he was killed by a drone for his sermons. Do you think that speech advocating violence should be protected just as much as speech ridiculing religion?
Well, I don't believe in targeted assassinations. I think people should be brought to trial. And that, of course, is what happened with Osama bin Laden. He was assassinated. He was unarmed. I've covered wars for 20 years. When you shoot somebody who doesn't carry a weapon in a war zone, that's a war crime. And, if we speak in the language of targeted assassinations, they will speak back to us in the language of targeted assassinations. Terrorism is always the resort of the dispossessed because they don't have militarized drones and they don't have Hellfire missiles. And they don't have the 82nd Airborne. But we're really talking about state terror as spawning terror. And for those of us who have spent as long as I have in the Middle East, this is what's so disturbing. We don't understand how our decision to impose our quote-unquote will or virtues by force throughout the Muslim world is the main factor behind the proliferation of jihadist and radical groups.
Interestingly, if you take a look at terrorist attacks that have been committed across the EU in the last 5 years, less than 2% of them have been religiously motivated at all, according to Europol data. I mean, considering the data, why do you think this clash of civilizations narrative has been so successful?
Well, because it doesn't force us to examine ourselves. It's a celebration of ourselves. It is racist at its core. It's a demonization of the other. These people are less civilized, more barbaric, and it makes us feel superior and is a kind of way to justify the things we do in the name of imperial power. So it plays to a narrative which a lot of people lap up, but which is completely false.
I also wanted to get your comments on some questions Julian Assange raised when talking about the recent attacks. As we know, French authorities were already monitoring the Kouachi brothers. Why do you think that surveillance against these men didn't stop the deadly attack?
Well, that's a good question. I know, having covered Al-Qaeda in France, that they have very heavy phone wiretaps. I remember a Ministry of Interior official telling me that there are 23 different dialects of Arabic in Algeria, and in real time they have the ability to translate every single one of those dialects. So these people are heavily monitored, and that's a good question, but somebody from inside France's security service would have to answer that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Assange was making the point that this is a good example of kind of how wanton surveillance actually backfires when it should have been targeted. I'm not sure. That is a good question, though. I wanted to take a moment also to reflect on Gitmo. I know that we just kind of mentioned this, but 117 men, 127 languishing, 117 out of the 127 languishing without any charges against them. I mean, given what we know, given everything that you just outlined about the blowback, about how all of this exacerbates the hatred, fuels this, why don't you think there's not more political will to close down this facility and also hold torturers accountable?
You broke up on me at the beginning. Are you talking which facility?
Oh, I was just talking about
Guantanamo?
Guantanamo.
Oh, yeah, our offshore penal colony. Why? Well, because a lot of countries don't want to take these people who large number we now know are innocent, who've been brutalized for years. If you had put me through what the force-feeding regimen and psychological torture and everything else, that you can guess what I'd do if they released me in Yemen. So I think that's just another example of how we are quite efficient at manufacturing jihadists. Baghdadi, by the way, the head of ISIS, came out of our black sites as well. And by all accounts, by the way, he's a Muslim. Actually, unlike other leaders, he actually has training as a Muslim scholar. Never went in there that radicalized. He was radicalized by our abuse.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of prisons, I want to move on to a recent article you just wrote about Alcatraz. Really fascinating, being from the Oakland area, in which you described the Disneyfication of the site as one of the many ways we whitewash this country's deep-rooted problems with mass incarceration. We have about 2 minutes left, but how did you experience that, and how did you come to that conclusion?
Well, I teach in a prison, so again, it's this false narrative. You go to Alcatraz, where horrendous human suffering, heavy use of prolonged isolation, which drove prisoners insane, had the highest sort of insanity rate of any prison in the country, and you begin that narrative. I mean, they even resurrect the repugnant J. Edgar Hoover as kind of, a force for good. You tell these cops and robbers stories. I mean, Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly and all this kind of stuff, and you don't expose the horrific suffering that not only took place in Alcatraz, but now takes place across the United States, where we have 25% of the world's prison population and 5% of the world's population itself. And we use, prolonged isolation, which is, universally by human rights groups considered a form of torture, for literally tens of thousands of prisoners, often for years on end. You go to Britain, I'm not defending the British prison system, you get people put in isolation, maybe three or four a year.
Norway too.
So that's a whole nother story. But the system of mass incarceration in the United States is a window into the form of predatory capitalism, because under the 13th Amendment, it's all neo-slavery. They work for $1.30 a day for Chevron and all sorts of profit corporations.
Chris Hedges, thank you so much for joining me. Always amazing to have your insight. Thanks so much for watching, you guys. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and join me tomorrow when I break the set all over again.